помічника Дональда Трампа з питань національної безпеки генерала Фліна. 20 березня директор ФБР публічно заявив про те, що, цитата, «ця агенція веде розслідування зв'язків між особами у...» Поправки веде розслідування, чи справді мають місце зв'язки між представниками кампанії Трампа та уряду Росії. Я хочу чітко заявити, що ця інформація, це розслідування стосується не партійних відмінностей між республіканцями та демократами та не перегляду результатів виборів. Натомість йдеться про те, щоб відповісти, активно і ефективно відповісти на загрозу з боку Росії за те, щоб притягнути Росію до відповідальності за безпрецедентний напад на нашу демократію. Ми також маємо бути здатними відповісти та зупинити подібні атаки у майбутньому. Я сподіваюся, що президент, так само як і ми, прагне зрозуміти, що відбулося. Я також маю наголосити, що останні кричущі та нічим не підтверджені заяви Дональда Трампа, буцімто його прослуховування за згоди попередньої адміністрації, викликають велике занепокоєння. На цьому комітеті лежить значна відповідальність. Ми маємо довести, що ми можемо і надалі відходити від політичних лейблів, ярликів і добратися до правди. Ми маємо довести і показати, як представники обох партій разом натхненно працювали заради досягнення правди. Я хочу підтвердити, ми завершимо це розслідування і доберемося до самої суті того, що відбулося. Ми також будемо прагнути отримати всі факти від розвідувальної спільноти. Я хочу подякувати пану голові за його відданість збереженню двопартійної співпраці, яка співпраці між демократами та республіканцями є реальністю у цьому комітеті, якщо навіть не у Конгресі загалом. Що ж, ми будемо намагатися рухатися настільки швидко, як це можливо, але спершу я представлю наших свідків. Рорі Гадсон, професор університету Джорджтауну. Він спеціалізується на дослідженнях безпеки вже понад 40 десятиріч. Він був піонером дослідження розвідувальної тематики. Published with other scholars and practitioners innovative studies on adapting American security paradigm. Він є співзасновником консорціуму з дослідження розвідувальної тематики і є одним з найбільш цитованих авторів у царині досліджень розвідки. Доктор Годсон також був консультантом Ради безпеки США, а також інших агенцій Сполучених Штатів. Наш наступний свідок – це Юджин Румер з центру фонду Карнегі. Румер був екс-державним експертом з питань розвідки та Євразії у державних установах США. Він також викладав у Національному університеті оборони та корпорації РЕНД. Він також був співробітником Радбезу США. Він активно публікується. Вітаю вас. Клінт Вотс, дослідник Центру Foreign Policy Research Institute Program on National Security. Пан Вотс також є консультантом. Він займається прогнозом загрозливих дій та розробкою відповіді на них. У якості консультанта він розробляє підготовку, освітні програми для розвідки, професіоналів оборони на рівні країни та штатів. Клін також був військовим США, агентом ФБР, працював у сфері контртерору, а також був консультантом контртерористичного підрозділу ФБР. Дякую вам. Що ж, на цьому я даю слово нашим свідкам. Дякую, пане голово. Учасники комітету, дякую за запрошення на ці слухання. Я хочу розпочати, представивши історію радянських активних заходів і відзначивши про важливі переваги, які Радянський Союз та Росія мали на основі свого історичного досвіду роботи з цими інструментами. Також я хотів би звернути увагу на те, що ми у минулому робили для того, щоб зменшити ефективність радянської поведінки, і на що ми можемо зважити у майбутньому в якості нашої відповіді на дії Росії. Якщо подивитися на історію останнього сторіччя, ми побачимо, що росіяни, що їх радянські попередники вірили, що активні заходи є важливим інструментом для досягнення їх цілей, які перед собою ставила Росія та СРСР. Вони вірять, що ці активні заходи дають їм змогу досягати впливу далеко за межами їх економічного розвитку та умов усередині самої країни. Подивімося на те, що вони говорять просто зараз. І те, як вони діють, те, що вони роблять на практиці у царині активних заходів, вони дуже активно ставляться до цієї тематики. Іноді ми у Сполучених Штатах розуміємо це і усвідомлюємо це, але можна сказати, що вже багато десятиріч ми перестали ставитися до цієї тематики серйозно, і Росія скористалася цим. Просто сьогодні можна говорити про те, що Росія переконана, що вони можуть вживати весь цей інструментарій настільки ж ефективно і за тими ж лекалами, як вони робили це у минулому. Мені здається, що вони повторюють свої минулі практики часів СРСР. Так, можливо, є нові техніки, які вони використовують просто зараз. Вони є відмінністю від минулого. І, думаю, мої колеги розкажуть про це більше. Ми почуємо більш експертні думки про ці техніки, зокрема використання інтернету, кіберпростору, але більш-менше можу вас запевнити, що росіяни будуть і надалі використовувати всі можливості для удосконалення ефективності своїх активних заходів. Так, їх дії у США схоже, мають абсолютно винятковий характер. У нас не так багато прикладів втручання у вибори. І я уточню, скажу, що у нас немає доказів того, що росіяни чи СРСР впливали конкретно на результати виборів. Але що ми маємо? Докази, чого ми маємо, так це спроби вплинути на вибори непрямими методами. Зокрема, маємо багато прикладів цього вже у 21 сторіччі. Росіяни, наступники СРСР, дотримуються думки, що вони здатні, так би мовити, ефективно битися за межами своєї вагової категорії, якщо брати аналогію з боксу. Вони не прагнуть війни з будь-ким з нас, але за рахунок своїх активних заходів, а саме комбінації прихованих та відкритих технік та ресурсів, досягати своїх політичних цілей не військовими засобами. Росіяни вважають, що як лідери Росії вважають, що мають використовувати все це заради досягнення національних цілей. У 20-30-х роках минулого сторіччя Росія створила з нуля організації, які, попри бідність СРСР на той час, могли ефективно кидати виклик країнам світу, Європи, США. Розбудова цих організацій була вікоповним зусиллям, яке необхідно визначити. У ході Другої світової війни вони використали цей апарат впливу, створений напередодні війни, використали цей апарат для того, щоб впливати на політику Європи. Але хочу відзначити, так, СРСР використовувала той самий апарат і у ході війни проти нацистів, допомагаючи силам союзників перемогти фашистські режими. Надалі ж цей апарат використовувався для впливу на баланс сил у Європі. Це відбувалося і у ході Другої світової війни, і після неї. Вони намагалися підтримати партії, які відповідали інтересам СРСР. Зокрема, підтримували вони подібні партії і на території США. Знаєте, у США вважали, наприклад, що дядечко Джо, так називали Йосипа Сталіна, був другом США. Ми не звертали уваги на багато дій СРСР саме через це і прокліпали очима посилення впливу СРСР у Західній Європі. Тоді на рівні виборів, на рівні підтримки різних політичних сил, Захід ледь втримав контроль над багатьма країнами, які зараз є осередком Західної Європи. Надалі, у 50-х та 60-х роках СРСР змогли досягнути значних результатів. Так само у 70-х, 80-х їм майже вдалося у 80-х розколоти НАТО. Це відбувалося за адміністрації Картера, продовжилося за адміністрації Рейгана. На щастя, тоді ми вчасно це помітили. Було проведено переозброєння НАТО, і це сталося не за бажання СРСР, не те, що СРСР нас до цього підштовхнули. Ні, ця відповідь була усвідомленою відповіддю НАТО на дії СРСР. Йдеться про переозброєння НАТО у 80-х роках. Нинішні лідери Росії на чолі з Володимиром Путіним, знаєте, можливо, зарано оцінювати, наскільки вони ефективні, але просто зараз, як відзначили очільники цього комітету, у нас є причини вважати, що росіяни ефективно відпрацювали щодо Сполучених Штатів, і от, власне, через це Сенатський комітет із розвідки аналізує всі ці питання. Отже, коротше, Росія витрачає мільярди, як і раніше, мільярди доларів на заходи активного впливу. Це десятки тисяч осіб, які працюють у царині заходів активного впливу, йдеться. І це не лише тролі і таке інше. Я хочу я хочу перервати вас на секунду і нагадати, що у Сенаті зараз іде голосування, тому я хочу сказати членам комітету, що вони можуть відходити для того, щоб взяти участь у голосуванні і повертатися. А вас, пане свідко, закликаю якомога швидше все це підсумувати. Але скажу так, росіяни не по 5 метрів зросту, не по 5 метрів ростом. Вони не завжди перемагають. Вони добре використовують свої засоби, але перемагають не завжди. Хочу нагадати, що у 40-х, 60-х роках ми успішно протидіяли активним заходам СРСР. Ми адекватно оцінили їх методику і змогли придушити активні використання радянського інструментарію проти нас. На жаль, у 60-х мали місце коаліція, яка раніше існувала між консерваторами та лібералами в законодавчих органах США, її розпад, а також інші події у нашій розвідспільноті, вони, по суті, завадили нам активно, настільки ж ефективно протидіяти радянських заходам, що ж надалі у 70-х, аж до кінця 70-х у нас не було ефективного інструментарію протидії активним заходам з боку Росії. У 80-х це змінилося, і ми почали знову ефективно протидіяти СРСР. Що ж, саме тоді було розроблено стратегічний підхід до протидії активним заходам з боку Росії. До того у нас були такі, наші дії мали точковий характер. Після того, як ми розробили стратегічний підхід, ми вже могли передбачати, що буде робити СРСР, обмежувати вплив, обмежувати ефективність активних заходів з боку СРСР. І тоді ж ми почали підтримати ліберальні сили за межами США, які, на нашу думку, могли допомогти нам запобігти поширенню впливу СРСР у суспільствах, які ми хотіли підтримати. Що ж, у цьому ми були досить успішні за рахунок відкритих та прихованих заходів з нашого боку. Що ж, які ще ми мали перемоги після Першої чи Другої світової війни? Так само, як ми мали перемоги після Першої, Другої світової війни, після Холодної війни, після закінчення Холодної війни, на жаль, ми увійшли у період сплячки, ми припинили активно займатися цим питанням. Йдеться не лише про розвідспільноту. Уряд взагалі пішов на таке самотужки обране роззброєння у сенсі здатності протистояти активним заходам з боку Росії. Я знаю, що свого часу члени цього комітету зверталися до уряду із закликами краще протидіяти заходам активного характеру з боку Росії. На жаль, уряд, тоді адміністрація Обами, не звернули уваги на ці заклики. Тож, знаєте, з огляду на те, що адміністрація Барака Обами проігнорувала ці заклики, ми б не мали ситуації, про яку говоримо просто зараз. Що ж, я сподіваюся, що ви, я перепрошую за затримку, вона була технічною, я сподіваюся, що ви проаналізуєте наш досвід і адміністрація та законодавчі органи вдадуться до необхідних органів. Слово бере наступний свідок, члени комітету. Для мене честь бути тут сьогодні. Російські активні заходи та втручання у нашу президентську кампанію є одним з найбільш гострих запитань національної дискусії у США. Я вірю, що розвідка США та її ставленики втрутилися у наші вибори у 2016 році. Я не бачив засекречених свідчень про це питання. Але вважаю, що ті, хто заявляють про те, що відсутність конкретних свідчень цього втручання оминає те, наскільки очевидним насправді є весь масив заходів впливу з боку Росії. Подивимося на російських тролів, російську пропаганду і таке інше. Все, що відбувається відкрито, все це є частиною проблеми. Давайте подивимося на те, що відбувалося від часу кінця Холодної війни. Кожен росіянин інформувався під впливом результатів Другої світової війни. У 41-му році гітлерівські війська було зупинено на кордоні Москви. У 45-му армії Сталіна увійшли до Берліна Це те покоління вважається найвеличнішим в історії. Росіян з того часу освічували, їм казали, що саме тоді їх країна була найсильнішою. Росіяни вважають, що в 91-му році вони втратили набутки свого найвеличнішого покоління. Після розколу СРСР у росіян просто не було вибору, окрім прийняти те, що відбулося, як факт. Між тим, для багатьох росіян велич Заходу, яка послідувала за, очевидно, велич та переваги Заходу, які послідували за розвалом СРСР, були свідченням. На їх думку, все це відбувалося за рахунок Росії. Що ж, наступні заходи, наступні дії Росії стали відповіді на це. І ми стали свідками цього у Грузії, Україні і та нинішньої війни на сході України. Повернення Росії на міжнародну сцену – це питання відновлення балансу у відносинах із Заходом, хоча інші називають це реваншизмом. У Росії вважають, що вони відновлюють справедливість. Від початку ери Путіна росіян переконують, що йдеться про відновлення справедливості. Росіян так само переконують, що всі, хто не згоджується з урядовою ідеологією, є зрадниками. Але давайте подивимося на Росію об'єктивно. Її ВВП у рази поступається ВВП США та ЄС. Їх економіка набагато слабша за економіку західних країн. Між тим, ця економіка сильніша, ніж економіка її бідних сусідів. Війна НАТО-Росія обернулася обопільним суїцидом, і Москва не готова до цього. Через це Росія використовує абсолютно інший інструментарій – дезінформацію, шпіонаж і таке інше. Цей набір інструментів має дати Росії змогу ефективно діяти попри відставання від Заходу у військовій та інших сферах. Подивимося на те, як діє Росія. Жменька кіберзлочинців може наробити не менше шкоди, ніж бронетанкова бригада. Подивимося, які результати принесло втручання Росії у вибори. Вони завдали шкоди лідерству США у світі, стало ефективною демонстрацією змоги Росії впливати навіть на події у єдиній суперсилі світу. Окрім того, втручання Росії також створило кризу, яка все ще триває в американській політиці. Я думаю, що Росія буде звертатися до цього ж інструментарію і надалі у Франції та Німеччині, де цього року відбуваються вибори, а також у майбутньому Росія також, ймовірно, буде втручатися у наші подальші акти волевиявлення на рівні виборів до Сенату, Конгресу та президента. Слово пану Ватсу, голову, члени комітету. У недалекому минулому ми звернули увагу на кампанію на сайті Білого дому, яка закликала до надання автономії Алясці, повернення Алясці до Росії. Ця петиція отримала десятки тисяч підписів. Ми звернули увагу на те, хто підписували цю петицію на сайті Білого дому. Схоже, що ці петиції підписували боти. Мережі ботів також використовувалися Росією в інших заходах в СРСР. У соціальних мережах, Твіттері та Фейсбуці вони проштовхують певні думки. Боти діють синхронно, використовують одні й ті самі заклики. Деякі з цих ботів у соціальних мережах напряму заявляють про свої симпатії до Росії. Назагал можна говорити про те, що Росія відновила та модернізувала використання активних заходів, які продемонстрували свою ефективність ще за часів СРСР. Росія активно проштовхує кандидатів на вибори у західних країнах, які підтримують порядок денний Росії, але це не їх єдина мета, тобто привести цих кандидатів до перемоги на виборах. Вони назагал прагнуть підірвати рівень довіри громадян західних країн до органів влади, усіх органів влади на Заході. Назагал вони також намагаються розмити межу між правдою та брехнею в інформаційному просторі. Тож Кремль намагається підірвати демократії зсередини. Їх головні цілі – це розвал ЄС та НАТО. Досягнення цієї мети, на думку Кремля, дозволить Росії відновити свій вплив на міжнародній арені. Починаючи з 2013 і 2015 року, ми бачили активні намагання вплинути на те, як американці сприймають дії власного уряду. Йдеться про дезінформацію у царині у ситуаціях з військовими навчаннями на території США, заворушеннями у американських містах та інше. Росія використовує економічний, дезінформаційний інструментарій у своїх заходах. Вони намагаються залякувати, їх страшилки також включають глобальні катастрофи, чи то економічні, військові, чи кліматичні. ЗМІ, які активно поширювали фейкові новини у США, часто розташовані у Східній Європі. Весь цей обшир інструментарію, який використовує Росія, вся ця російська пропаганда, має на мету вплинути на непоінформованих громадян країн Заходу. Починаючи з початку 2016 року та навіть раніше, Росія взялася за намагання вплинути на перебіг виборів у США за рахунок інформаційних інструментів. На мою думку, сенатор США республіканець Рубіо, один з кандидатів у президенти, також став жертвою російської пропаганди. Пізніше ми бачили точкові зливи через Wikileaks та сайт DC-Leaks, який діяв на місцевому рівні у США. Ці зливи однозначно вплинули на інформаційну атмосферу виборів у США. Я хочу також звернути на фальшиві новини, поширені RT та супутником про буцімто захоплення російської військової бази американської військової бази на Близькому Сході. А надалі експерт наводить технічні подробиці того, як відбувається кожна конкретна дезінформаційна кампанія, як вона починається з мейнстрім ЗМІ, спирається на використання ключових слів і надалі підхоплюється ботами в інтернет-просторі та у соціальних мережах.
Many of the accounts we watch push the false Incilic story today focus on the elections in Europe, promoting fears of immigration or false claims of refugee criminality. They've not forgotten about the U.S. either.
У багатьох випадках ми бачили, просто зараз російська пропаганда поширює інформацію про ситуацію з біженцями у Європі для того, щоб вплинути на тамтешні вибори. Тож, чого ми маємо остерігатися відповідно до російських активних російських заходів? Росія активно використовує інформаційну війну для того, щоб розвалити суспільну структуру своїх країн-суперників.
It's time the United States reminds the world that despite our day-to-day policy debates and political squabbles, we stand united alongside our allies in defending our democratic.
Стратегічна мета Росії – розділити західних союзників та досягнути їх розвалу. Найефективнішим засобом відповісти на це з нашого боку буде відповісти на це єдністю та тримати стабільність наших структур. Я хочу завершити на тому, з чого почав. Пане голово, мої повні свідчення ви можете, прошу їх долучити, опублікувати на сайті комітету. На цьому я завершую мої свідчення. Дякую за ваші свідчення та за те, що надали ваші свідчення у друкованому вигляді. Їх буде досліджено.
It always impresses me the fact that when we hear people talking about Russian policy and what they want.
Сенаторіш, панове, я завжди вражений, що коли ми говоримо про російську політику та те, чого вони хочуть, по-перше, наскільки одностайні всі. Всі, здається, погоджуються з приводу того, що Росія робить і як вона це робить.
Because everyone's got a shelf life, and his has been extended. It looks to me.
Але давайте подумаємо про те, що буде відбуватися у Росії після Путіна. Знаєте, ніхто не вічний. І життя, і на мою думку, життя Путіна, політичне життя Путіна вже триває більше, ніж тривало б за інших обставин. Скажіть мені, будь ласка, що, на вашу думку, відбуватиметься після відходу Путіна від влади? Чи залишиться Росія на тому ж курсі, чи змінить свої підходи і прагнутиме інших цілей? Так, дякую за запитання. Як ви знаєте, тут багато чинників, багато факторів зміни. По-перше, як ми будемо відповідати на дії Путіна та дії його апарату? Чи дозволимо ми путінському апарату продовжувати ефективно діяти за напрямками, названими, обраними Путіним? Чи ми нарешті якось на це відповімо? Чи дозволимо ми Росії залишитися безкарною за її дії? Це важливі запитання. Знаєте, якщо ми їх не покараємо, то російська еліта, яка залишиться на місці після Путіна, не матиме причин відмовлятися від такої політики, таких дій. Як вже я і сказав, просто зараз весь цей комплекс заходів дозволяє Росії, так би мовити, ефективно битися з суперниками за межами її природної вагової категорії. Тож я думаю, що якщо ми активно не відповімо на те, що робить Росія, у них будуть всі причини продовжувати таку політику і надалі. Дякую, пане. Путіну, як мені здається, 62 роки. Це чоловік у розквіті сил. Думаю, що у 2018 році він буде обиратися повторно, ще на 6 років. Тож я думаю, що ситуація лишатиметься незмінною ще довго. Думаю, що ще 2 президентські терміни, ще 12 років Путіна. Відповідно, і нашу політику треба формувати відповідно. Думаю, було б неправильно та контрпродуктивно чесати усіх росіян під один гребінець. Але на загал можна говорити про певну послідовність в історичних традиціях російських підходів до безпеки. Я б сказав, що російська філософія державної безпеки не сильно змінилася з часом, тож нам треба думати про те, що, я думаю, нам треба очікувати, що радикальних змін у Росії не буде. Знаєте, ми колись вже бачили радикальні зміни у Росії у 90-х, але з того часу реальних змін не спостерігалося. Думаю, що доки росіяни, російська еліта будуть сприймати себе як сторону, яка відстоє, як сторону, яка поступається інше, вони будуть використовувати весь обшир своїх інструментів для того, щоб дати відпір. Звісно, можна теоретизувати про те, що у разі обрання російського опозиційного лідера боротьба з корупцією, такого як Навальний, політика там зміниться, але на загал раджу орієнтуватися на незмінність російської політики. Знаєте, щодо Путіна, по-перше, думаю, Путін лишатиметься при владі. Думаю, що він сам обере собі наступника, це по-друге. І також третій фактор, який не треба відкидати, це зв'язки з криміналітетом, зв'язки між російською владою та криміналітетом. Ми бачимо, як Росія використовує хакерів, кіберзлочинців у царині активних заходів. Але думаю, що надалі ми також побачимо таку хижацьку еліту, особливий феномен на стику між офіційно російською владою та криміналітетом. І думаю, у майбутньому вона також буде використовуватися у заходах в інтересах Росії. Я був кадетом Вестпойнту, коли СРСР розвалився, і знаєте, зараз аналізуючи, що відбувається, мені важко зрозуміти, у чому, власне, полягають національні інтереси самих США. Даю слово бере сенатор Файнстайн, це демократичний сенатор. Панове, дякую за вашу присутність, дякую за ваші свідчення. Перепрошую, щойно повернулася до зали, пропустила частину ваших свідчень. Я тут вже 16 років у цьому комітеті. І знаєте, доповідь розвідки, спільна доповідь наших розвідувальних агенцій, поширена на початку цього року, говорить про мотивації та масштаби російського втручання у наші вибори, по використання медіазасобів та інструментів у царині кіберзаходів. Що ж, власне, ця доповідь заявляє, що втручання у вибори у США відбувалося за безпосереднього наказу Путіну з метою підірвати довіру американців до виборів взагалі та нашкодити Гіларі Клінтон особисто. Також розвідка США дійшла висновку, що Путін та російський уряд надавали перевагу Дональду Трампу. Тож, 2 запитання. Чи вірите ви, що розвідка вірна у своїй оцінці мети, яку ставила перед собою Росія у ході виборів? Тому дайте мені просто так чи ні. Хто хоче почати першим? Що ж, дякую за складне запитання. Скажу так, я не бачу проблем особисто з доповіді, на яку ви звернули увагу, але мені здається, треба переглянути оту частину, де кажуть, що все це було розроблено у 2016 році. Я не думаю, що росіяни могли б досягнути поставлених цілей, якби почали у 2016 році. Ну, би просто змоги не було. Знаєте, заходи у царення активних заходів, перепрошую за тавтологію, не потребують часу для підготовки. А тож скажіть, коли, на вашу думку, почалася ця кампанія? Ну, не назву точну дату, але заходи у царення, дії у царині активних заходів спираються на певну інфраструктуру. І цю інфраструктуру необхідно створювати. Тож Тож, на мою думку, заради досягнення поставлених цілей, Росія однозначно мала спиратися на певну інфраструктуру, створену раніше.
It's not 3 months or 6 months training or a year's training. They have much longer training periods, and some of them are pretty good. Not 10 feet tall, of course, but pretty good.
Okay, I got the point.
Знаєте, для того, щоб створити подібну інфраструктуру, підготувати спеціалістів, потрібен не квартал, не півроку, а тривалий час. Добре, я вас зрозуміла. Наступна особа. Так. Так, і я думаю, що можу назвати час, скільки вони готувалися. Я думаю, що 2009, тоді ми вперше стали свідками розробки інфраструктури активних заходів з боку Росії. Ну і пізніше, у 2013, 2014, 2016 Росія почала воєдино зв'язувати всю свою інфраструктуру впливу з різних сфер, як то заходи у кіберсфері, заходи інформаційного впливу та інше. Шановні слухачі, ваш перекладач втомився фізично та від власних помилок. Я беру невеличку паузу для того, щоб перезарядитися. Закликаю вас всіх слідкувати, поширювати цю трансляцію вже в англомовному варіанті. Я не на довгий час, можливо, і на триваліший час покидаю вас.
And another Eastern European country that's escaping me. In 2015-16, the Brexit campaign should be examined. I can't prove it one way or another. And then today, all of the European elections that they're choosing to meddle in. France, Germany, Netherlands, Czech Republic.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
Yes, they have conducted such campaigns in Ukraine in 2004 and 2014, in Georgia. They've intervened heavily in domestic political campaigns in the Baltic states, so there are ample examples of that.
Thank you. Would you please respond, Doctor?
Yes, they have a history of doing this well before this, and they find it a successful use of their resources, so it is not surprising.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Senator Rubio.
Thank you all for being here. I'm concerned that in our inquiry, and I certainly think it's important for us to know what happened, we are focusing so much on the tactics that we're not focusing on the broader strategy that's at play here. I want to briefly go through a number of instances and have the panel comment on whether or not they believe these are indicative of the efforts that are being targeted against the United States and the rest of the world by Vladimir Putin. We all know that Angela Merkel has taken a tough line on Ukraine against Russia. We know that there's a lot of controversy in Germany around migrants. In early 2016, a 13-year-old known only as Lisa F., a dual Russian-German citizen whose family had moved to Germany from Russia in 2004, told police she had been kidnapped in East Berlin by what appeared to be Middle Eastern migrants and raped for over 30 hours. There was outrage in Germany and obviously protests against Merkel. The Russian foreign minister almost immediately jumped on the story, talking about the need to defend our Lisa, quote unquote. And of course, this story was spread far and wide by Russian-speaking entities and Russian media outlets. Subsequently, the prosecutors in Berlin announced that they had clear evidence that during those 30 hours she was missing, Lisa F. was actually, in fact, with people that she knew, and a medical examination showed that she had not been the victim of a rape. Earlier this year, a little-known news outlet published on a website an article that claimed that the United States was deploying 3,600 tanks to Eastern Europe to prepare for war with Russia. 3,600 tanks would represent about 40% of our entire tank force. Within days, the story was republished by dozens of outlets in the United States and throughout Europe. As it turns out, the truth is we deployed 87 tanks. There is, in going all the way back to September 11th of 2015, residents in Louisiana awoke to a message, many of them did, on their Twitter feed that said, "Toxic fume hazard warning in this area until 1:30 p.m. Take shelter, check local media, and ColumbiaChemical.com." On Twitter accounts, there were hundreds of accounts documenting a disaster right down the road from the people. One account said, "A powerful explosion heard from miles away happened at a chemical plant in Centerville, Louisiana." A man named John Merritt tweeted. Anna Rusella shared an image of flames engulfing the plant. At KSarah12 posted a video of surveillance footage from a local gas station capturing the explosion. Another Twitter account posted a screenshot of CNN's homepage showing the story had already made national news, claiming that ISIS had claimed credit for the attack, according to one YouTube video. A woman named Zopak9, Anna McLaren is her name, I guess, tweeted at Karl Rove, "Karl, is this really ISIS responsible for the hashtag Colombian chemicals? Tell Obama we should bomb Iraq." Had anyone had taken the trouble to check CNN, as this article in the New York Times outlines, there was no such attack. It was a hoax. Not some simple prank, as the article goes on to say, but a highly coordinated disinformation campaign involving dozens of fake accounts that posted hundreds of tweets for hours, targeting a list of figures precisely chosen to generate maximum attention. The perpetrators didn't just doctor screenshots from CNN, and I'm reading from the New York Times article. They also created functional clones of the websites of the Louisiana TV stations and the like. The list goes on and on. We should fully document it in our report to the American people. A false story spreading claiming that Germany's oldest church had been burnt down by 1,000 Muslims chanting Allah Akbar. Another story claiming that the European Union was planning to ban snowmen as racist. All of this, and on, and we should begin to document them for the American people. Isn't this the larger problem? Let me just rephrase that. Aren't we in the midst of a blitzkrieg, for lack of a better term, of informational warfare conducted by Russian trolls under the command of Vladimir Putin, designed to sow instability, pit us against each other as Americans? This same article, I don't have enough time, it goes on. They posted false stories about a police shooting in Atlanta that never happened, about a series of things. In essence, are we in danger here because we are focused on a very important tactical move that happened in the election of 2016 to miss the broader point? And that is that this is a coordinated effort across multiple spectrums to sow instability and to pit Americans against one another, politically, socioeconomically, demographically, and the like.
So I think the two lines of effort you brought up there that the Russians use are social dynamics that they play on, ethnic divisions, and global calamity or inciting fear. These two lines haven't been discussed much. The third one is financial. They oftentimes put out fake stories about U.S. companies, which then cause stock dips, which allow all sorts of predatory trading and other things to happen. We've focused on disinformation around the political scene, but misinformation across the board, particularly from the Russian propaganda networks, has incited fear inside the United States on multiple occasions, as you noted. One last year there was a JFK terminal shut down about alleged gunshots. We watched social media trolls and gray outlets pump fake stories out, which ramped up that fear, which caused mass panic. So they have created the ability by gaining audience in the United States to steer Americans unwittingly in many different directions that can cause all sorts of danger and even violence in certain cases. I think the Pizzagate scandal that we saw last fall is another such example of misinformation, maybe not attributed to Russia, but we have a problem writ large right now with our information sources.
Senator Rubio, do you want to further?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, and I don't really have a lot to add to it. We are faced with a strategic attack. It's not a kinetic attack usually. It's a political attack. And then the question comes, what sort of strategic response are we going to be able to develop to that? And we could elaborate on that.
Senator Warner. Again, thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Dr. Rumor, I want to start with you. We've heard a lot recently about the role of Oleg Deripaska, the head of Russia's largest aluminum company, and the role he may have played in helping to support the goals of President Putin. Can you characterize Mr. Deripaska's role in this area? And then more broadly, are there any of the oligarchs in Russia, at least those not in exile, that aren't somehow caught up in the Kremlin's foreign policy activities? Are there any of them that are truly independent?
Thank you, Senator Warner. I can't add anything to the conversation about Mr. Deripaska beyond what's appeared in the public domain. So I don't think I have any special insights here. You know, I feed off the same reporting that's appeared in the papers. I would be careful to describe all Russian oligarchs, and oligarch itself is a fairly ill-defined term. There's sort of a handful of some of those prominent ones, but it's a much bigger class of major Russian businessmen. I would be reluctant to describe them all as, you know, tools of the Kremlin. Obviously, Russian businessmen who do business in Russia have to be mindful of Kremlin political preferences, and the Kremlin has considerable influence over them. But I can't speak concrete information about them being, you know, directly instruments of the Kremlin foreign policy. That's not something that I have evidence to back up. So I think I'll stop at that.
Okay, Mr. Watts. One of the things that your testimony, I've been talking a lot about the use of the internet trolls and their ability to then exponentially gain more power through creating these botnets. I'd love you to kind of comment about what we can do to preclude that on a going forward basis, and perhaps you can explain this technique better than I have in my various public statements.
Sure. The first thing that I think we need to understand is it's not all automated and it's not all human. There's a combination of the two. So you have a series of humans that work in their psychological warfare groups that command both bots at the same time. And I like to, as an analogy, you can look at it like artillery. So you have someone who's engaging with you as an individual, and at the same time they can launch a bot to amplify that story forward. When we watch,
obviously the bot, for those ability for a computer to take over other computers that are not being used and in fact magnify the number of hits they might hit to a particular social media site, correct?
Exactly. Or you can create more personas in Twitter, for example, which makes it look like there are more people than there really are. It's a Potemkin village strategy, essentially, that amplifies your appearance. So what they do is they launch those simultaneously as they begin the engagement or push of false news stories, usually from RT and Sputnik News. They do that in unison, which games the social media system such that such a high volume of content being pushed at the same time raises that into the trends that you'll see. If you looked at Facebook or Twitter or whatever it might be, you would see the top 10 stories that are out right now. It pushes that up there. As soon as it pushes that into that top 10 feed, mainstream media outlets then are watching that and they start to examine that content. So for example, the Incirlik attack I talked about, one of the key hashtags they pushed is media. The goal is to get that into the top of Twitter streams so that mainstream media has to respond to that story. When mainstream media responds to it or just looks at it without even commenting on it, it takes over organically and you'll see it move around the internet like a virus.
One thing, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on this afternoon, there have been reports that their ability to target this information, some reports at least saying that in the last week of the campaign in certain precincts in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there was so much misinformation coming, talking about Hillary Clinton's illnesses or Hillary Clinton stealing money from the State Department or other, that completely blanked out any of the back and forth that was actually going on in the campaign. One of the things that seems curious is, would the Russians on their own have that level of sophisticated knowledge about the American political system if they didn't at least get some advice from someone in America?
Yes, I know this from working on influence campaigns in the counterterrorism context. If you do an appropriate target audience analysis on social media, you can actually identify an audience in a foreign country or in the United States, parse out all of their preferences. The reason those bios had conservative, Christian, America, all those terms in it is those are the most common ones. If you inhale all the accounts of people in Wisconsin, you identify the most common terms in it. You just recreate accounts that look exactly like people from Wisconsin. So that way, whenever you're trying to socially engineer them and convince them that the information is true, it's much more simple because you see somebody and they look exactly like you, even down to the pictures. When you look at the pictures, it looks like an American from the Midwest or the South or Wisconsin or whatever the location is. And they will change those. They can reprogram them. Where they tend to show their hand is, the problem is once they build an audience, they don't want to get rid of it. So you'll see them build an audience and try and influence one segment, let's say, of the English-speaking media, and then they will reprogram it to try and influence a different story. It's the same problem any cable news outlet would have. Once you build an audience and you change your content to some other topic, you still want to keep your old audience, or otherwise you can't gain any traction.
And again, my time's up, but I just want to know, this can be used, it was used in 2016 towards one candidate, but obviously Russia's interests are Russia's interests.
Well, it's used right now against people on both sides of the aisle. So we will watch them play both sides. They might go after a Republican person in this room tomorrow, and then they'll switch. It's solely based on what they want to achieve in their own landscape, whatever the Russian foreign policy objectives are. So if they want to achieve one candidate, but let's say President Trump, for example, wins and now turns against, they will turn on President Trump as well. They win because they play both sides, and the audience will go with them once they have them.
I do know that the vice chairman hates Russia, just to make that public. Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Godson, you made the point that the Russians don't always win with their active measures, and you mentioned the period of the 1940s and the 1950s. In your judgment, how successful have the Russians been in the last year in achieving their goal of sowing doubt, polarization, trying to disrupt and cast doubt on the validity of the election, putting aside the issue for the moment of the critical question of whether there was any collusion between any campaign and the Russian efforts?
Well, from the information that we have in the public sector and the private sector, I would say that they must be rather pleased with the results of their investment, whatever date they started to develop this campaign. I think, though, however, the fact is that they are seeming to prepare to do the same thing in other campaigns abroad. And so, sort of looking at the way they've behaved over the long course of time that they've used active measures, I think they will continue to do this and to reap some benefits from it, unless there is a considerable response from the democratic societies. And at the moment, I would say that our response is too restrained, and that unless they see that there is a cost to this that makes this not a very attractive thing to do, I don't see why they won't continue it. I hope that's responsive.
Thank you. Dr. Rummer, Mr. Watts made the point that the Russians will go after either side, that they're trying to disrupt society, cast doubt on Western democracies. And one largely overlooked part of the Intelligence Committee's the Intelligence Community's report last fall was information in the annex that suggested that Russia Today, which most people view as an organ of the Russian government, was instrumental in trying to advance the protests of Occupy Wall Street. Could you comment on that? And is that an example of Russia working to promote the far left versus the far right that we hear so much about?
Yes, ma'am. It's a perfect example in that Occupy Wall Street was a genuine movement on the left. But it certainly serves the interests of Russian propaganda to play it up as a major challenge, as something representing a major fault line in our society, because it drives the message that the United States is in decline, the United States is in crisis, plays up to audiences at home in Russia and abroad that the United States is not the perfect society, something that they really like to emphasize. So that's an excellent example, and I think it deserves the attention that you, the spotlight that you cast on it. Mr. Watts referred to the minor protests outside our base in Incirlik in Turkey. Well, there's another example that there was a protest, but again, it's blown out of all proportions. And as you know, the best propaganda is that which has a grain of truth to it, then gets played up and up and up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me say thank you to our witnesses. Gentlemen, here's where we are now. The American people are worried about what's ahead with regard to Russia. The public now gets most of its information from leaks, from daily press stories, and apparently inaccurate tweets from the president. This feeds distrust and causes Americans to question the legitimacy of our government. So I believe the committee needs to lift the fog of secrecy about what really happened to our democracy. That's why it's so important we have open hearings with the Intelligence Committee, the FBI, Homeland Security, and Treasury. And I believe a key to a successful investigation is following the money. Yesterday, I wrote a letter to the chairman and the vice chair urging the committee look into any and all financial relationships between Russia and Donald Trump and his associates. I'm also taking this issue on as a ranking member of the Finance Committee, of which Senator Burr and Senator Warner are also members. I and other members of the Finance Committee have already urged that the committee exercise its authority to obtain and review Donald Trump's tax returns. This review ought to include the Trump Organization and its partnerships. Senate investigators should also look into any violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which ensures that investors are not paying bribes overseas. The Treasury Department is responsible for other programs and investigations that may uncover suspicious financial activities by Donald Trump and his associates. It is already a matter of public record that entities associated with Donald Trump have been the subject of millions of dollars of fines for willful, repeated, and long-standing violations of anti-money laundering laws. Information about Donald Trump's finances, his family, and his associates may lead to Russia. We know that in 2008, the president's son said that Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross-section of a lot of our assets. Since then, we've gotten mostly smoke and mirrors. The committee needs to follow the money wherever it leads, because if money laundering, corruption of any kind, or fishy real estate deals point to the Russian oligarchs and criminal elements, then the Russian government may only be a step or two away from us. So now, my question. There is an extraordinary history of money laundering in Russia. billions of dollars from corruption and other illegal activities have been moved out of the country. What that means is that Russia's corruption problem may also be our corruption problem. So here's my question for the three of you as experts on Russia. I'd like you three to tell us about corruption in Russia so as to help us follow the money in our investigation. And here's my specific question. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Watts. How can the committee track this fuzzy line between the Russian oligarchs, Russian organized crime, and the Russian government?
Thanks, Senator. I would first start off with I'm not the foremost Russian expert. I came to this through the Islamic State and ISIS. I'm really a counterterrorism person for the most part, and came to active measures mostly because active measures came after me. The second part that I would add to this discussion, though, is there is a money trail to be searched for and discovered. And we've focused very heavily on elites in our public discussion. What are elite people doing? But this influence action has both a virtual component and a physical component that's happened. I would say that what I can't see, which I would want to know, is what is happening in Eastern Europe. There's a disproportionate number of fake news outlets, conspiratorial websites that are run from there that are English-speaking editors that are pro-Russian, trained in Russia sometimes. How are they funded? That would be one component. My guess or my estimate, my hypothesis working in the intelligence field is that there is some sort of Russian intel asset that is funding them in one way or another through some sort of scheme. The other part that I think we should be looking at is follow the trail of dead Russians. There's been more dead Russians in the past 3 months that are tied to this investigation who have assets in banks all over the world. They are dropping dead even in Western countries. We've seen arrests in, I believe it's Spain and different computer security companies that are based in Russia, which provide services to the United States. These are all huge openings to understand how they are funded by the Russian government. I don't have the capability to do that from where I sit, but I think that's a huge angle. If you can prove that part of it, I have to say on the influence side, we can see it. The one thing that's been misconstrued in the public discussion about Russian influence is that it's covert. You can hack stuff and be covert, but you can't influence and be covert. You have to ultimately show your hand. And that's why we've been able to discover it online. But the missing part is, how did they conduct this influence? There are newspapers, there are media outlets. The Balkans are littered right now with these sorts of outlets, and that's where I would start to dig on the financial space.
I'm almost out of time. Dr. Rumer, same thing. This fuzzy line is what I'm particularly interested in. Organized crime, oligarchs, and the government. I heard you talk about one person. You couldn't comment on him, but just give me your analysis about this fuzzy line, because I keep coming back to that.
Well, sir, it is definitely a fuzzy line, and I think those relationships are probably best discussed not in an open session. Because
but you're saying they ought to be discussed.
I believe they ought to be discussed.
Good. Fair enough.
But I do believe that it is something for our intelligence community to take up rather than for us to discuss in open.
I probably ought to quit while I'm ahead.
Senator Blunt.
Mr. Chairman, can Mr. Godson just finish that question?
Dr. Godson, quickly. Turn your mic on.
I'm very pleased that you're having this open session. I think it's very useful. But I do think that this is a sensitive subject, and so that it will require skill and care on the part of our society, so we don't overreact, which in our history we sometimes have, to being surprised. And so I do think it's, there was more time to discuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you.
Dr. Godson, let's just start right there. Why do you think I've got about 4 questions, so they don't need to be exhaustive, and I can follow up with more written questions later. And Mr. Watson, I'm going to come to you next. Why do you think there was this element of surprise? I mean, this is not new Russian activity in other places in the world. I think Mr. Watts said it had to start before 2016, but it does seem that the intel community, the U.S. government, the media is surprised that they have this level of involvement. You just said we shouldn't have been surprised. Why do you think we were surprised?
Well, I do think it has something to do with our culture, that we don't expect people to behave in this particular way. We've been surprised many times in our history, so I don't think it's
we expected to do it everywhere else, but not do it here?
Well, we just are sort of surprised when somebody takes a concerted effort to be involved in our affairs. We know that sometimes this happens abroad, but we don't really sort of think this is a major tool or instrument that people use. And so we found ourselves surprised in the 40s and the 70s and the 80s and so on. And so I'm not too surprised we are surprised.
Mr. Watts, why do you think we seem to have been so unready for this?
One, our intelligence community has been over-focused on terrorism and the Islamic State, and there wasn't much resources or bandwidth to focus on it. The second one is our traditional methods for detecting and counterintelligence, things like active measures, are based on humans. We run spies versus counter-spies. Most of this influence came online. They essentially duplicated the old active measure system without setting foot inside the United States. I think the third part of it is the intel community in the United States is very biased against open source information, and they've been surprised repeatedly. ISIS, the Arab Spring, you can go back over the past 6 to 7 years. We worry a lot about security clearances and badges and who gets access to doors and does the break room have a shredder? But when it comes to the open source, we miss what's right in front of our nose. My two colleagues and I use 3 laptops, and we do this at our house. But for some reason, the entire Intel apparatus with billions of dollars will miss a tweet or a Facebook post that's right in front of them, but will be highly focused on this security system and these closed sources, which are super useful. But we've not changed that orientation in our intel community.
Mr. Romer, in Europe, do you think the interventions there were so obviously different that we wouldn't have caught on, or how do you see the difference in what the Russians have done, particularly in the last 15 years in Europe, and what they did here?
Well, there was an element of unpreparedness on our part. I agree with my colleagues. I would say that, well, I can speak from personal experience, and that is I just didn't believe that any one intervention, any one agent can swing our election across 50 states. I thought nobody in the right mind would try to take on the challenge of such expense and complexity. But then when you think about it more carefully, as we have now with the benefit of hindsight, if you look at the election of 2000, when the Florida vote was decided by a very small number of votes, when we now know some of the votes were decided, in some states were decided by a very small margin, you realize that, a more sophisticated actor that has, as my colleagues have pointed out, years and decades of experience of playing in this field, can actually aspire to make a meaningful difference.
Let me ask another question about that. I know the vice chairman mentioned hand counting of ballots in the recent elections in one European country. You said that the Russian intelligence services directly intervened. We don't have any reason to believe, any of you can answer this, that they intervened in any election counting system this time. I think we should be concerned that never be allowed to happen, and one of our goals here should be to be sure we're protecting that part of the process. But when you said directly intervened in the elections, no indication, Mr. Rumor, of directly intervening anywhere in the counting of votes on Election Day?
Right. There are public statements from our intelligence community and law enforcement and DHS that our counting systems have not been affected. I can only go on the strength of that, and I fully believe that statement. But we certainly should be aware of that and concerned about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to start out by just thanking the Chairman and the Vice Chairman for their willingness to work so closely together on leading this investigation. I certainly think that today's hearing is helpful in setting a baseline for the intentions and the techniques of Russia's active measures campaigns, but I also look forward to public hearings in which we can dig even deeper into the substance of what happened specifically in the 2016 election. Similarly, I believe it's critical that we dig into the financial aspects involved and that we follow the money to determine whether and how the Russians have used financial leverage to achieve their strategic goals. I think we need to do everything possible to get to the truth. The American people certainly deserve no less. And I think if we do not take this seriously, it is not hyperbolic to say that our fundamental democratic institutions are at risk. Dr. Godson said something in his statement for the record about the history of relying on agents of influence. In other words, recruiting and co-opting sympathetic groups or individuals in the U.S. and in the West to advance the Russian agenda. Do you all agree that financing is one of the methods often used by Russia to recruit sympathetic agents?
Yes.
Yes, there's publicly available evidence of Moscow-based bank financing one of the presidential candidates in France.
So when they use financial resources to recruit agents of influence, like the example you just made, is it always a simple of exchange of money for assistance, or does Russia sometimes attempt to buy influence more subtly through access to lucrative business deals and contracts and those kinds of arrangements?
Yes, I think all of the above we can show examples of in the past.
Yes, they have used their considerable financial business leverage in Eastern Europe to cut favorable energy deals, to offer lucrative deals to local companies and governments.
I think the key point in this is comparing it to Soviet active measures to today is we didn't do business transactions with the Soviet Union. So they have so many more access points to compromise people financially or to influence them on the financial space that they couldn't have done during the Cold War.
This next question is for any of you. I'm curious if you see money in politics as an opening for Russia to be able to potentially manipulate our elections, especially given their expertise at moving financial resources through networks and the change in our own environment in which there is now a lack of transparency in the current U.S. campaign finance environment, where oftentimes you have elections where a majority of the dollars spent are not even originating from the individual candidates themselves. Have any of you given that some thought?
So I think it's a little bit overstated based on the public part of it. The Russians aren't stupid. They know that if they are ever caught directly putting money into what looks like a Manchurian candidate kind of scenario, this could be provocation for war, or it could be sanctions, it could be a host of different things. At the same point, I would also offer you, from an intelligence perspective, why not look at it as a way to compromise somebody? So if you have a candidate that's doing well and you have very open campaign finance, why not slip them some money where they don't know the original source of it, such that if it's revealed later, they are discredited? So it can go both ways. It's not just promotion. It can also be used as a tool and a weapon.
You, Mr. Watts, I think did a really good job of laying out for us how these influence operations actually have the impact of sort of organically changing the trends on media and end up being sort of a self-reinforcing mechanism. Are there analytic or digital tools that can discount the impact of those bots and of that manufactured forcing mechanism within the way that information travels on the web today and impacts the media?
So I think all the social media companies are starting to realize that their ad revenue mechanisms can be manipulated for this. There are more than just Russian fake news out there. You've got profiteers, you've got political groups that do that, and you've got, satire, which is thrown in the mix of it. You're seeing the social media companies try and regulate this now or deem things as fake news, but that's going to fail. Ultimately, any attempt to deem things as fake or not fake is going to lead to freedom of speech violations, freedom of the press violations. Because how do you do that? How do you determine who's being fair or not? I think a better way to do it, and what we propose, is to create the version of Information Consumer Reports, which is an independent agency which is funded by the social media companies, has no government involvement, no government funding, that provides a rating in terms of the news that shows up on your feed, such that, much like nutrition labels on food, you know what you're consuming. Right now, part of the reason this is so effective is a fake news outlet can pop up one day, pump out stories that are sensational, and fall down the next. The consumer, an American, on their Facebook feed, which is curated to the things that they like to click on, and even in their Google searches, which is curated to things other people like to click on like them, end up clicking on these things because they're popular. If they had a score or a rating, some sort of symbol there that said, you're more than welcome to click on this, but this is the National Enquirer, you can evaluate how much of it is truth and how much is manipulated truth and how much is false. And just like we saw with Consumer Reports when I was growing up, it had 15 variables. It's rated over time, and it becomes a trusted integer that you can go to. I think that's a better way to do it. We're not restricting Americans' freedom of speech and press, and at the same point, where if they want to look at fake news, they can look at it, but they know what they're getting into.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Langford.
It's hard to believe we're even having this hearing today discussing this topic, since Putin already cleared this up earlier today. He came out with a public statement just hours ago saying, "Watch my lips, no," and then followed up with, "All these things are fictional, illusory, provocations, lies, used for domestic American political agendas. The anti-Russian card is played by different political forces inside the United States to trade on and consolidate their positions inside." Well, he certainly consolidated us. It is painful to watch the Russian people trapped in a regime that is doing this worldwide. They'd like to be able to watch the Olympics and know their athletes weren't doped ahead of time. They would like to believe their own news when the Russians proclaim we're not in Ukraine and we're not in Syria, and they are, and it'd be nice if we could, as he said, watch my lips and know that he's not trying to deceive our audiences. My question is, first, why did he think he could get away with it this time? This is not new for the Russians. They've done this for a long time across Europe, but it was much more engaging this time in our election. Why now? Mr. Watts.
I think this answer is very simple and is what no one is really saying in this room, which is part of the reason active measures have worked in this U.S. election is because the commander-in-chief has used Russian active measures at time against his opponents. On 14 August 2016, his campaign chairman, after a debunked Incirlik...
When you say his, who's his?
Paul Manafort, cited the fake Incirlik story as a terrorist attack on CNN, and he used it as a talking point. On 11 October, President Trump stood on a stage and cited what appears to be a fake news story from Sputnik News that disappeared from the internet. He denies the intel from the United States about Russia. He claimed that the election could be rigged. That was the #1 theme pushed by RT, Sputnik News, white outlets all the way up until the election. He's made claims of voter fraud, that President Obama is not a citizen, that, Congressman Cruz is not a citizen. So part of the reason active measures works, and it does today in terms of Trump Tower being wiretapped, is because they parrot the same lines. So Putin is correct. He can say that he's not influencing anything because he's just putting out his stance. But until we get a firm basis on fact and fiction in our own country, get some agreement about the facts, whether it be do I support the intelligence community or a story I read on my Twitter feed, we're going to have a big problem. I can tell you right now today, gray outlets that are Soviet pushing accounts tweet at President Trump during high volumes when they know he's online, and they push conspiracy theories. So if he is to click on one of those or cite one of those, it just proves Putin correct, that we can use this as a lever against the Americans.
So this started in 2008-9 time period, as you've cited before with your previous timeline. Even before this rose up, even when there were 16 Republican candidates on the stage, this was a long time coming, and it seemed to be very well organized this time. Part of my question is, I get that completely. Why this time? They look to be more prepared, probing, evaluating states, trying to get into voter records, trying to be more active in the process.
They have plausible deniability. If you wanted to run this during the Cold War, you would have had to put agents inside the United States. They would have been stalked by counterintelligence professionals. They would have been run down. You couldn't have gained an audience on a communist newspaper, for example. Today, you can create the content, gain the audience, build the bots, pick out the election and even the voters that are valued the most in swing states, and actually insert the right content in a deliberate period. They pre-planned it. They were based a year and a half out. They're doing it today on the European elections. And here's the other thing that needs to come up. They try all messages. You know, we've been very focused on, you know, our presidential election. The Republicans, you know, tend to come up, but the Democrats, they were there too. They were with Bernie Sanders supporters trying to influence them in different directions. So they play all sides. They, much like I learned in infantry school about how they use artillery. They fire artillery everywhere, and once they get a break in the wall, that's where they swarm in and they focus. And they do that very well today. You'll see them in Europe supporting people on the left or right, whichever will dismantle the democratic function that they're after. So I think the important point moving forward is we have to educate our public and even our institutions. And the mainstream media is right to be taking some on the chin right now. They've fallen for a lot of these fake news stories. They've amplified it, and they've not gone back and done good fact-checking. The media needs to improve. Our U.S. government institutions need to improve. And we got to help Americans understand what the facts are. Because if we don't, we are lost. We will become two separate, maybe three separate worlds in the United States, just because of this little bitty pinprick that was put in by a foreign country.
Which is their goal on that, Mr. Chairman?
Senator Manchin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I want to thank Senator King for allowing me. I have another meeting I've got to attend, but I wanted to ask this question. I've been around long enough to remember that my school desk at home protected me if I jumped underneath of it, held my head during the nuclear attack from Russia. I'm not sure that my United States Senate desk, if I jump underneath of it and hold my head, will protect me this time. And that's putting it mildly. With that being said, much has been written about the new hybrid style of warfare practiced by the Russians recently in Georgia, Crimea, and Ukraine. To be brief, Russia believes the lines between war and peace are blurred. Wars are no longer declared and no longer fought in a traditional manner. And the power of non-military means to achieve objectives exceeds the power of weapons and effectiveness. Some label it the Gerasimov doctrine, which is a combination of political, military, economic, social, and media means to achieve Russian strategic objectives. In the United States, we would call this a whole of government approach. So my question would be to any of you, and I'll start with you, Mr. Watts, if possible, is Russia's meddling in our 2016 elections proof the United States is dealing with a nation that is acting in its own warlike manner?
Yes. Would you like me to comment on some of the things we can do? Yeah, so there are 7 or 8 things we could do immediately that are not very complicated.
And my desk is not going to save me this time, right?
No, and I'll tell you right now, I'm going to walk out of here today. I'm going to be cyber attacked. I'm going to be discredited by trolls. You know, my biggest fear isn't being on Putin's hit list or psychological warfare targeting. I've been doing that for 2 years. My biggest concern right now is I don't know what the American stance is on Russia and who's going to take care of me. I mean, after years in the Army and the FBI, working in the intel communities today, I'm going to walk out of here and ain't nobody going to be covering my back. I'm going to be on my own. And so that's very disconcerting. And I think that speaks to what we need to do. One, in terms of falsehoods, we need to do 2 things. We need a State Department and a DHS website that immediately refute when falsehoods are put out. These seem silly when they come out. Incirlik, terrorist attack, for example. But the quicker they're refuted, the faster they die in social media. We caught the Incirlik attack because it was refuted quickly. When the Russians fake it, it gets exposed. If it goes on too long, it gets into mainstream media and it runs out of control. The other part is the FBI. they're doing a great job in terms of investigating hacking, but the hacking powers influence. Whenever there's a hack, we should immediately go in and look at what was stolen and figure out what is the anticipated smear campaign discrediting, how is this going to be weaponized and influenced. The next one I think is super important, which is educating U.S. businesses. Treasury and Commerce right now need to be doing awareness campaigns. Their companies suffer smear campaigns from foreign countries right now, which change their stock prices. Their employees are in social media and are being picked off through social engineering and hacked at. The other part really is in the private sector and the public sector that we need to look at. Mainstream media companies, we need to be working with them. What if they boycotted WikiLeaks collectively? What if they all didn't race to publish too quickly? If those damaging, stolen information that is misconstrued oftentimes doesn't get into the mainstream media, if all of them block it out, Russia's influence dies on the vine. And the last thing I think is the social media companies. Whether we like it or not, social media has become the news provider for almost all Americans. Our preferences shape what we see, and our friends share stuff with us, and it reinforces our views. And so I think that for them, they're worried about these state-sponsored groups in their systems and how it's going to erode their company.
Dr. Gordon, I'd like to ask you, if possible, when the Iron Curtain fell and Russia fell out of the world power status, superpower status, I might say, how long was that hiatus? And when it came back, did it come back with a vengeance because of Putin's leadership and determination not to be shelved? Turn your mic on, sir.
I wish we knew had more information about about this. Some areas we know a lot, and some areas.
Well, do you all see basically a drop off of their during the 90s? When
we do see a bit of a drop off, yes. However, the training and the development of cadre continues. The hierarchy wasn't well established in terms of controlling all the various aspects.
Was it under Putin basically all this came back? Can anybody say that, Dr. Rumer?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. In the 1990s, Russia was flat on its back. It just didn't have the resources, and a lot of the capital in this area that it had accumulated basically fell apart. I think they were very, very frustrated during the Balkan Wars when they really couldn't counter what they saw as our information domination of the airwaves. So in the early 2000s, when their economy came back, the apparatus came back with it too. Could I just add one?
Could I just ask one thing, because my time is running out here? Under Putin, do you believe it's impossible to build a relationship to basically bring this back into some type of civility or order? Is it he's just absolutely, totally committed the direction he's been going and will continue to go no matter what?
Can I just add an answer to that quickly? It depends on what the costs are. In other words, what are we going to do in response?
So he only reacts out of power. Strength. He only reacts back out of strength if we have the strength.
Well, most of us react to power and strength too. But in this case, we don't yet have enough information. I mean, the committee and the study that you're doing is very important for us, not just scholars and studying this subject. It's very important because we can't really answer the question about why this time and why it's successful. We're not even sure what happened here. Now, we have the ICA statement of January. But I just sort of want to put in a note of caution here. We sometimes in the United States think we know things, and we have a sort of group think, and we all express certain views. And then we find out that later on maybe the source of our evidence, the way we put the evidence together, didn't really make as much sense as we thought it did at the time. Now, we've had that in our recent experience. I mean, in the 90s and 2002 and 3, and so on. So I would just say we need a little bit of caution here to be able to know exactly what happened. There's so much information out in the real and false and mixture.
Sir, I want to thank you so much. I've really exceeded my time. They've been so kind to me, but thank you.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance this morning. I want to return to the topic Senator Langford broached, which is why Vladimir Putin and Russia's leaders thought they could get away with such a brazen set of actions last year, and doing so in a, quote, noisy fashion, as Director Comey testified last week. Dr. Godson, I'd like to hear your point of view on this, and specifically I'd like to hear your thoughts about the context in which Vladimir Putin did this in 2015 and 2016. In the previous 8 years, Russia had invaded Georgia, it had invaded and seized Crimea, its rebels had been supported and backed in eastern Ukraine to occupy the Donbas. They'd been provided missiles that had shot a civilian aircraft out of the sky. Russia had repeatedly violated the INF Treaty, and the Obama administration had come into office proclaiming a reset, and then in 2012, Barack Obama mocked his opponent for claiming that Russia was our #1 foe and promised Dmitry Medvedev that more could be done after the election when he had more flexibility. Would that series of events have emboldened Vladimir Putin to think he might be able to get away with such a noisy intrusion into our political system?
Well, I would suggest that you're right. I think that this does not help in restraining Russian interests in expanding in the near abroad and as far abroad as they can, and so that the train of actions that you described there didn't exactly persuade him that we would take his intervening in other matters such as elections seriously, and so that it's going to take, I think, some time and some activity by the United States, some important activity to be able to establish our reputation in this arena. And I know it's beyond the sort of just the remit of the Intelligence Committee, but intelligence can play a major role in this. But I think this is a whole of government business, a policy issue, and so it's going to be more than intelligence. But I would hope, though, that we are, in fact, gaining the kinds of information we need to have an informed judgment about that you are asking about. In other words, was he tempted by our lack of action? I hope, I presume, that the intelligence community has a tasking that identifies the Soviet responses and their perceptions, and that if we don't have such a tasking on this subject, then we won't be in a very good position to ask it. But I think, in general, yes, I agree with the point you're making. I think the evidence is strong, but we need stronger information to keep us to give us a better judgment on this kind of issue.
Dr. Rimmer, I don't think you've had a chance to opine on this question yet.
Thank you, sir. I believe that the biggest factor in Putin's decision to pursue this aggressive line of intervention in our domestic politics has been the realization on their part, as Mr. Watts has suggested, that this is a very lucrative environment in which they can achieve a lot with even a remotely plausible claim of deniability. So I think they just took advantage of the environment here.
Mr. Watts.
Yeah, I'd like to add two things to what I said before. One, I don't think they thought their hand was going to be exposed as much as it is today. I think they thought they could do it in a more subtle fashion. And so my belief is right now in Russia, they're probably trying to figure out how do I manage this situation now where I have extended myself. But the overriding issue with why Russia did this to the United States and does it now to Europe is we are weak. We do not respond. We have no organized response as a country or even policy towards Russia right now. So I think until we set the boundaries about how we are going to either push-pull with them, they're going to move as far as they can, pushing, and then when we set our policy positions, which we don't have right now, they'll move in kind based on whatever that is.
I have one final question about active measures. Dr. Godson, you talked in your testimony, or in your opening statement, about some of the history of Russian active measures. It's been going on for a long time. Bob Gates, former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense, wrote in his first memoir, From the Shadows, about Russia's campaign against the NATO deployment of intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe in 1983, quote, during the period the Soviets mounted a massive covert action operation aimed at thwarting INF deployments by NATO. We at the CIA devoted tremendous resources and effort at the time to uncovering this Soviet covert campaign, end quote. The United States is currently undergoing a long-delayed, deeply needed nuclear modernization campaign, upgrading our bombers, our dual-capable aircraft, our ground-based missiles, a long-range standoff cruise missile, and our submarine capability as well. Do you believe there's any chance that Russia is not currently engaged in an active measure campaign to try to thwart that modernization effort in the United States?
I think you're right. I do believe almost certainly that they are, if not already engaged in it, they will be.
Because that is simply what Russia does.
That is simply what this particular leadership, the successors to the previous generations, yes, believe and do. I don't think it's inevitable all Russians will do this, but I think these fellows will do it.
I apologize, gentlemen. My time has expired.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to sort of sum up what I've heard this morning, number one, it appears that we're engaged in a new form of aggression, if not war, that the Soviet Union and now Russia has been utilizing for many years, but is now taking it to a much higher level. It strikes me that Vladimir Putin is playing a weak hand very well. A couple of questions to try to, very, very short. I would say that what we've seen and what you've told us this morning is that what we saw in the 2016 election is absolutely consistent with prior Russian practice and current Russian practice in other parts of Europe and the world. Is that correct, Mr. Watts?
Yes, it's still going on today.
Secondly, is it your opinion that this is going to continue? In other words, 2016 is not a one-off.
No, I mean, they're going to continue until something meets their challenge. And right now, there's nothing meeting their challenge. Any European effort I've seen is very small in comparison.
And Mr. Rumer, would you say that, Dr. Rumer, that Putin is a Democrat, a Republican, or an opportunist?
I think it's he's an opportunist. And even if we counter this, or when we counter his efforts, he will continue anyway. It's going to be a dynamic, not a sort of static situation where we deploy countermeasures and that stops. But it will keep going on.
I think it's very important, though, that we realize that he is neither a Democrat nor a Republican, because it means that everybody on this dais and everybody in political life in America, regardless of their party, is at risk. In 2016, it happened to tilt because of his interest toward the presidential candidate of the Republican Party, but it could very well be the opposite in 2020 or 2022. Mr. Watts, you're nodding, but I can't record that.
Yes, they will shift to whichever one supports or is most amenable to their foreign policy position, or who they think is weak for manipulation. That they will go with whichever one it is.
And one thing that was mentioned today somewhat briefly, but it came up in some of the questions, is not only did they hack the Democratic National Committee and misinformation and disinformation and all of that, but they also pushed and probed into our state election systems in a number of states. Apparently, the information that we have thus far is it didn't work. But they tried, and Mr. Watts, would you agree that they weren't trying for fun? This wasn't entertainment. They were looking for a place to make changes in election results.
What no one's talking about is the information nukes that Russia sits on right now, because they hacked 3,000 to 4,000 people. I think this afternoon you're going to hear on the cyber, more technical side, this hacking was pervasive. We've focused on the DNC. I've been targeted. Some other people have been targeted that I know. They have our information. So anytime anyone rises up that they choose against, whether it's Republican or Democrat, Congress or executive branch or a state official, they've got the ability to do the same thing they just did over the past year.
And I want to touch on that in a minute, but I do want, do you believe that they will try again to compromise state-level election voting machines, registration rolls?
They could.
That's what they tried this time.
I don't think it's about breaking into the election machines. The goal is to create the perception that the vote may not be authentic. And so that's why it's smart to target voter rolls, because just the act of hitting a voter roll doesn't change the votes. But then you can run an influence story that says there's voter fraud in the United States, that the election's rigged, that the count wasn't accurate, and you can gain traction with it. It's a pinprick perception that they're trying to create.
You've mentioned several times, and I think the Russian term is compromat, and I think it's interesting that they have a Russian term, which is compromising information. And this is active in the sense that not only can they take things off your computer, they can put things on your computer that will compromise you. And I think that should send a shudder through all Americans that this isn't only taking, if you can be very careful in your emails, but something can show up on your computer that's fake, and you could be in a lot of trouble. This is one of their techniques, is it not?
Yes, Americans should look to Europe, where this has happened quite a bit more frequently.
And finally, you talked a bit about defenses, and I think this is something that our committee in its report is going to have to look at. Cyber strategy is one. We have no cyber strategy in this country. There's no knowledge around the world of how we will react to a cyber attack, and I think that's part of what we have to do. Digital literacy, and that is people understanding the limitations of what they have on the internet. My wife has a sign in our kitchen that says, the problem with quotes on the internet is you can't determine whether they're authentic. Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
And, you know, we have to educate our people that they can't believe everything that they read on the internet. And part of that is, I think, your very creative suggestion of a kind of Snopes, expanded Snopes to check the validity, so people at least know, okay, there's some likelihood that is untrue. And finally, public awareness, which is what this hearing is all about. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cornyn.
Mr. Chairman, let me start by complimenting you and the Vice Chairman again for your leadership, and it's really important. I saw Senator Langford, Senator King, thank you. I'm had a blank on TV this morning talking about why this is so important to our country and why it's so important we have a bipartisan investigation and follow the facts wherever they may lead. But Mr. Watts, let me follow up on some of what Senator King was alluding to. I remember, of course, it wasn't that long ago where the Office of Personnel Management was hacked and 21 million records, personnel records, were stolen of U.S. government workers. Of that, about 5 million plus fingerprints included. I'm also remembering that a few years ago there was a story, I think it was in 2016, a story about the tactics that Putin uses to discredit political opponents in Russia and elsewhere. The New York Times story I pulled up said, foes of Russia say child pornography is planted to ruin them. The sort of tactics that are being used both domestically and internationally against foes of the Putin administration, the sort of hacks, the cyber attacks and the access to personnel records, the computers of all of us, all of these render us susceptible to this sort of influence campaigns, correct?
Yes, Americans need to understand that anything they do on the computer can be public at some point.
And just because it appears on the computer doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Correct. Fact and fiction have been wildly blurred over the past few years.
Regarding the last election and Putin's active measures effort, is it reasonable to conclude that any efforts made to weaken the candidacy of Hillary Clinton by doing damage to her reputation, credibility, and political standing would have been a desirable outcome for Russia, even if she were elected president?
Yes, the goal was either to get your candidate elected that you approve of, or to just totally discredit and undermine the mandate of whoever does win, should it be your opponent.
Mr. Ruber? Yes, sir. I agree. So, do we have any reason to believe that Putin knew more than the pundits and pollsters did here in America about the outcome of the election before it occurred?
No.
The electoral result is what I'm referring to. I didn't think so. Dr. Godson, you mentioned earlier
and I believe several of you alluded to this, about a strategic approach to countermeasures. Would you briefly describe what some of those might be? And I would like to have a more extended conversation at some point about what each of you would recommend for the United States government to do to engage in a strategic approach of countermeasures to this sort of campaign. Dr. Godson?
Well, we have had a historical precedent for developing that strategic approach. This is actually what happened in the Reagan years. That we decided that we had to. It was a major active measures offensive, much higher than people had expected, and we had to respond. And so there were a couple of things that were done then, which seemed to be quite effective, and I would recommend we take those things that worked and put them into our strategic approach. This will take.
Could you give us a few examples?
Yeah. Well, one is what we're sort of starting to do now, and what you're starting to do is educating the American and other populations about the threat of active measures and the price one can pay for successful active measures. So that when they know and hear about it, they're not taken by it. It doesn't influence. So one is education. A second capability that we would need would be then ways of reducing the effectiveness of the active measures. First is warning, anticipating, education, and then what can be done to reduce the effectiveness of the active measures. And one of the things that worked in the past was exposing the perpetrators of the active measures, preferably in real time, but anyway, exposure.
As Mr. Watts pointed out, the advent of social media and the use of social media to move fake stories around the internet and to get mainstream media to pay attention to them, and without authenticating the source of the information, then repeating it, successfully amplifying that message, strikes me as a huge challenge. Right. All of us have run for elections and had to deal with the changes in the way we communicate with each other, and it is a huge challenge. I don't know how we get to the bottom of this and find some site, some trusted site, government or otherwise, that says this is the truth, this is not the truth. Don't believe what you're being told.
Well, we did, Senator. We did have some good experience with it. We didn't have the machines. They didn't have those capabilities, the mechanical capabilities, but we still were able to discredit a lot of their active measures and the apparatus, and so it was effective for a while. The third part of this, though, is sort of really the hard part is what kind of whole of government responses are we going to develop to actually deal with the problem? We sort of have to come to grips with this, and as I said, this may not be the only committee that has to deal with this. But we have to say, what are we willing to tolerate? Are there any red lines for us that if they go over this line, then there will be these kinds of responses? We developed this kind of deterrence policy. We have rules of the road in deterrence, so both sides don't get too close to each other on these on nuclear weapons issues. But we're going to have to start to figure out what it is we're going to do and what we're going to accept and what we're going to tolerate and what kinds of responses we're going to have, not just once in a while, but consistently in this arena. And I thank you, though, for the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Harris.
Thank you, and I want to thank the chairman and vice chairman for this open hearing. As this committee conducts its investigation into Russia's interference with our 2016 United States election, the American people need to fully understand the threat that we face and what we must do to protect ourselves in the future. And let's all be clear about what happened. We know, as has already been determined, a foreign country, Russia, attacked the heart of our democracy, an American election for the President of the United States. And they can and will do so again if we do not act urgently. We must get to the bottom of this. We must be thorough, we must proceed with urgency, and we must be transparent. That is vital to protect the public's trust in us, and it's what the American people deserve. And I know we can do so while protecting classified sources and material. Items that must remain classified in order to protect our national security, the sources of our intelligence, and the sensitive methods by which we collect it. This hearing is a first step to understand Russia's interference, but it cannot end here. We must build on today's hearing with future open hearings as much as possible. And I strongly believe an informed public is one of our best weapons against future attacks. That being said, I have a question for all of you, and I'll start with Mr. Watts. Earlier this week, former President Vice President Cheney said Russia's interference in our election should be considered an act of war. Assuming this was an act of war, Russia is investing in cyber weapons and cyber soldiers, which we call trolls, while we continue to invest in conventional weapons. As we invest in fighter jets and aircraft carriers, Russia is investing in state-run media from which it can push out fake news. As we consider investing more than $600 billion in our defense budget, Russia has approximately 1/10 of that amount in their budget and is developing its cyber warfare capabilities. I strongly believe cyber may be the new frontier of war. And so my question for you is, was this an act of war? And are we prepared for this new form of warfare? And equally important, given the everyday challenges of Americans in their everyday lives, why should they be concerned about this?
On the first part, an act of war, on the scale of warfare, it's not kinetic, but it's definitely part of the Cold War system that we knew 20, 30 years ago. Americans should be concerned because right now, a foreign country, whether they realize it or not, is pitting them against their neighbor, other political parties, ramping up divisions based on things that aren't true. They're trying to break down the trust they have in you as a senator, the Congress, the legislature, the court system. They're trying to break down all faith in those institutions. And if they can do that, if Americans don't believe that their vote counts, they're not going to show up to participate in democracy. If they don't believe that what they're doing is part of a government system that actually, if they don't believe in those institutions, everything breaks down. And when that breakdown occurs, we are focused internally and Russia is focused externally, achieving their goals. In terms of investments, part of the reason we don't invest well in cyber and we don't invest in information is because we're not buying big pieces of equipment. If you can't buy a big piece of equipment, then it's really hard to invest your dollars. We need to invest in people. The reason Russians win in cyber and information space is they have great propagandists and they have the best hackers that are out there that they can either enlist because they're criminals and sort of bring under their umbrella or train themselves. We, on the other hand, worry a lot about who we're going to bring into the cyber field because they might have smoked weed one day, or they can't pass a security clearance, or they didn't get a score on their ASVAB. But there's millions of talented Americans out there that can support these roles inside our government. We need to invest in humans moving forward in this space. And it's hard to get Americans to understand that, or even the Department of Defense, because you're talking about cyber and computers, and so you think of tech. But the truth is that tech only works if you got the smartest brains behind it. We do, but we don't put them against our fight.
Thank you. Dr. Rumor.
I think we should be careful using terms such as an act of war. It's definitely a continuation of warfare by other means. But, when you declare something to be an act of war, it calls for certain responses. An act of war, it calls for certain responses that we may not be ready to take on. I do agree with Mr. Watts on the need to be much more creative and approach the question of, call it cyber warfare. I, again, would caution that, Russians have a very different standard here in using their offensive tools than we use in using our cyber tools with a great deal of responsibility. And I think we should be very careful not to cross certain lines. We should, however, be using tools that are available to us and platforms that are available to us, just from a somewhat different domain. I think that our own spokesman, our own information projected, delivered from our platforms should be the gold standard of accuracy and objectivity. So from that standpoint, let me just say that, we're not using, for example, the platform of the State Department effectively. The practice of not sustaining our regular briefings for the media, for the world, is something that only hurts our interests.
Thank you.
I agree with my colleagues, so I won't repeat the same conclusions they reached. I would, though, like to introduce the idea, though, that cyber is important. Cyber wasn't considered so important 20 years ago, now considered important. But there are other technologies coming on board now. Some are visible to us. Some, they're not very salient. They haven't risen above the horizon. There are a whole number of technologies that are not internet dependent. And as we look at active measures now and into the future, I would think that would be on the agenda. I'll give just one example, virtual reality. Anybody who can set up the reality is going to have a very decided advantage in politics and other areas. And so as we're looking at cyber, and you are going to have a hearing and other studies of this, I would say just that we should broaden the concept of technologies that are going to be available, coming online, and it's be extremely unlikely that the Russians would ignore those technologies. And so maybe that would be something to add to the already busy agenda that you have. And thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harris. Thank you to all of our witnesses. All the questions have been asked except for mine. So let me, if I could, spend just a couple of minutes. And I agree with you, Dr. Godson. The ability to impersonate online is the next phase that we will go through. And we don't have our best and brightest yet focused on that. We're still trying to triage what happened to us versus to be creative and look forward and say what could happen. Mr. Watts, I heard you talk about intent and specifically the intent of the Russians and their effectiveness, and how pre-planning played a large part of the 16 effort. Here's my disconnect, is that when you, at least on the surface as we've gotten into the investigation, as you look at the emails that were captured either out of the DNC or out of the Podesta account that were then the source of Russia's effort through WikiLeaks to publicly lay this out. That seemed to be an average, ordinary Russian fishing expedition that we captured maybe 3,000 efforts at the same period in time. So, are you suggesting that they had an effort to mess with the elections and just happened to be lucky enough to?
They go widespread. Whatever are the best nuggets that come out of that is what they run with. They hit a gold mine, and they were able to successfully find the ammunition they wanted. What you see at other cases is they do compromise other accounts. I'm not going to talk about them. I don't want to amplify them, but they're less successful. You know, we'll hear dumps, and you'll be like, oh, this isn't really anything other than what I expected a politician to say. And so they hit a whale whenever they went fishing. But I would also say that somewhere in their cache right now, there's tremendous amounts of information laying around that can weaponize against other Americans.
We would agree with you on that. And very quickly, as you sort of summarized how fake news and how coordinated social media efforts push stories to the top 10 and they get picked up automatically. What is the takeaway for U.S. media outlets from what you've just said?
They have to improve their editorial processes, and they also have to take a step back from the I got to get it out first competitive environment. Part of the reason this Russian system works is every outlet races to get the story out first. When they do that, they put themselves at risk to fall for these sorts of schemes. And until they improve that, or until they collectively, we have some sort of standard that either the public or the media holds to itself, we're going to keep seeing them fall for these campaigns, whether it's Russia, by the way, or others.
Sure.
You're going to see many other nations take this on now. The playbook's been thrown out there.
Dr. Rumor, would you like to take the opportunity to address in greater detail what the Russians are doing in the French and German elections?
Well, sir, there's a wide effort in the German election to build up this far-right party, Alternative for Germany, ADF, to use them as sort of a credible challenger to Chancellor Angela Merkel. There are countless stories that are being spread through fake news sites, proliferating the media about the failures of Chancellor Merkel. They, as others have pointed out, have exploited the story about the girl that was not raped, but to again discredit her in the eyes of the general public, so as to point out her failure to protect Germany against a flood of refugees. That's one of the major policy initiatives that she took when the Syria crisis broke out. In the French election, we just saw something that really Putin hosted in the Kremlin. The leading far-right candidate, and almost with a smirk, said that we don't interfere in French elections, but we have the right to engage any candidate in the public domain in that contest. Also, Russian disinformation sources have spread malicious stories about one of the leading candidates, Emmanuel Macron, about his personal life. So
for the first time, we're really beginning to see an effort to build up and to absolutely destroy the character of others, having a double impact on potentially on the outcome of the election.
Yes, sir.
Good. Dr. Godson, just quickly, how did we respond differently when we overcame these active measures by Russians pre-80? And is there a lesson for us to learn from that in our actions now?
I think there are a number of lessons, but one was this exposure business, that we learned how to put out information into the public domain that not only was relevant for Americans, but for foreigners. And we briefed that, and we developed teams that could go out and talk about these things, and so neutralize a lot. That was one of the methods that we could replicate. A second was support to elements abroad who are trying to maintain the democratic process. We developed some capabilities to do that. We still have some. One of the outstanding examples is the National Endowment for Democracy, bipartisan, able to do quite a lot. But is also limited in various ways. And so one could look back and see how we were able to do this in different ways abroad that had an effect in the past. It's not that expensive financially.
Sure.
And those methods are available.
Thank you. Mr. Watts, just very briefly, has anybody taken you up on your list of recommendations?
No.
Okay. That did not go unnoticed by the committee. I want you to know that. And nor did the comment that there was agreement on at the table that America's response to date has been woefully short of what it should be. If anything, it should be interpreted, and it probably was interpreted by the Russians, that they can double down and, in fact, do it unscathed. So, Mr. Watts, we heard you when you said fact and fiction have become wildly blurred. Let me just assure you that this committee's mission every day on the intelligence community, 17 agencies, that assures the American people we do everything within the letter of the law. We first assure that to 85 other members of the Senate. So when it came time for a look inside what Russia active measures did and what our response was and how our intelligence community came to the assessments that they would, this fell right in our wheelhouse. This is what our professional staff does on a daily basis. This is a little more granular than what we do, It will take some time, and it means triaging a tremendous amount of documents. But I also heard from all three of you that if there was ever a time to get it right, it's now. And we have methodically built a process that builds a foundation of fact to build an investigation on that foundation that can hopefully come to a bipartisan finding where the conclusions are matched with the facts that we find. In some cases, as all three of you know, that might be intelligence product that can't be made public. But in every place that we can, I have pledged to the Vice Chairman, and he has pledged to his members, and I have pledged to mine, where we can make it public so that the American people understand it and feel that this has been credible and thorough and that the conclusions are valid, we're going to try to do that. But I also believe that the American people expect us to protect sources and methods. They expect us to work with the intelligence community in a way that strengthens what they do and how they do it, not by sharing that with everybody, but by certifying that they're doing it within the letter of the law to keep America safe. I look at this investigation as one extension of that, and it's to once again certify to the American people what we've done has been thorough, to hopefully provide some actionable conclusions for this administration, and to look back on the work that we do and believe that in 2018, 2020, we're going to be less concerned with Russia's involvement in our elections, and that the United States of America should, like we do on terrorism, work with any country in the world that might be the target of an aggressor like Vladimir Putin. So I'm grateful to you for what you've contributed to our investigation. This hearing's now adjourned.
Pretty good.